It's of course a great pleasure to be here at UC Berkeley. And yes, you're right. This is supposedly the project should have been finished by now. So these, as always, books take longer than we expect. And so this actually what I'm bringing here is like the last chapter of the book. The title of the book will be Fascist Pigs. It's genetics, industrialized organisms, and the building of fascism. The book has like two main sections. One on these issues of food production on the national soil, feeding the national community and the root. So how food production rooted populations to the national soil. So at least this was how fascists envisaged the role of food production. And the second part of the book is connected to imperial policies and to expansion policies of fascist regimes. So the three fascist regimes I'm dealing with are the Portuguese one, the Italian, and the German one. And today, so I'm bringing one of these chapters, this one on the circulation of Karakul ship and imperial landscapes of fascism. So in May 1944, Heinrich Himmler wrote to the SS Brigadenführer Landesbauernführer Kohler, urging him to take charge of a Karakul ship flock recently arrived at the SS Truppenübungsplatz Böhmen, a vast Waffen-SS training area located in the territory of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The flock had been brought in by agriculture officers of the military administration of Russland Süd and arrived in Bohemia following Germany's fast retreat in the Eastern Front. Himmler made clear his personal interest in the future exploration of the sheep herd and even inquired about the possibility of buying part of it. The property of the animals was contested territory and demanded careful negotiations between the SS, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry for the East. Here, I don't intend to explore the well-known rivalries of the different Nazi state agencies in the German colonial overtaking of Eastern Europe, namely the tensions between Himmler's SS and Rosenberg's ministry. Instead of delving into the Nazi bureaucratic maze, I prefer to follow the ship in illuminating German expansion plans into the East. So the first obvious question to make is about Himmler's keen interest in Karakul ship. In the very difficult military context of the spring of 1944, it may come as a bit surprising his detailed inquiry about the climate and soil conditions of the military camp, very different from those preferred by this ship. Such attention indicates Himmler's high expectations about the role of Karakul in the would-be German colonial rule in Eastern Europe. These were highly valued animals producing the famous Astrakhan fur coats that allegedly would contribute to the economic sustainability of German settler communities in the territories seized from the Soviet Union. Sheep farms were to be part of the colonies of settlers of the General Plan East, the Nazi blueprint for the future Eastern Europe architects of Himmler's Reichskommissariat for the strengthening of ethnic Germandom. The plan was to violently convert the region into a planner's Eden with towns, villages, forests, settlements, and industrial areas carefully distributed in the landscape and connected by a network of railway lines and autobahnen. In mid-July 1942, the day Hitler approved the plans for the settlement of those open spaces of the East, Himmler confessed it was the happiest day of his life and boasted about the greatest piece of colonization which the world will ever have seen, making the case for looking at the German invasion of the Soviet Union as the last great land grab in the long and bloody history of European colonialism. In the outskirts of the empire, in its most eastern regions, the new villages were to be inhabited by Aryan armed peasants, forming a defensive wall sustaining the barbaric Asian hordes. The Go East push was to be driven by the establishment of these colonial outposts, trusted with the double task of defending the ultimate ownership of the land conquered by the sword, with SS militias and increasing German blood to guarantee demographic expansion. If, following Turner's thesis, the experience of the Western frontier was the basis for American democracy, for the Nazi ideologues, the eastern frontier was to become the source of German cultural rejuvenation. Well, the arrival in Bohemia of the Karakul flock in 1944 from the Ukraine is a prosaic reminder of the short lifespan of such grandiose visions. The moment Himmler wrote Kohler, the Red Army had already expelled the Wehrmacht out of much of Ukraine, a key region for the establishment of the new order. The archive records don't explicitly tell us where in Ukraine did the ship came from, but it is reasonable to suppose they originated from the Karakul experiment station settled at Krivoj Rog in 1941 by the Ostministerium. The city, located in southeastern Ukraine, was signaled in the General Plan East as base of colonization of the Gottengau, which means it will be settled by the SS warrior farmers, the German frontiermen. After all, as Himmler's physician Felix Kersten recalled, all members of the SS dreamt of the grand estates in the East that had been promised to them as the first fruits after victory. But the General Plan East reminded that settlers also have the obligation to be exemplary managers and pioneers in the agricultural, technical, and economic aspects of farming. Settlers were to make intensive use of tractors, chemical fertilizers, and use seeds and animals bred to increase productivity. The Karakul experiment station at Krivoj Rog was thus part of a techno-scientific infrastructure built to produce the proper environment for the flourishing of settlers' communities, in this case, supplying warrior farmers with industrialized organisms and offering expertise on scientific animal husbandry as suggested in the General Plan East. The head of the Krivoj Rog experiment station was Hans Ornicek, who had temporarily left his post at the Animal Breeding Institute of the University of Halle to join the Ostministerium project in settling the frontier. When Rosenberg's ministry tried to hire Ornicek for a permanent position, his boss, Robert Gärtner, vehemently refused, arguing his importance for the handling of Halle's own Karakul flock. Ornicek was considered the main German expert in Karakul breeding after the premature death in 1940 of his master, Gustav Hollig, with whom he had co-authored the Karakul's Bible, which is called Das Karakulschaft und seine Zucht. Gärtner reminded that the Halle Karakul ship formed the purest flock in entire Europe and had already contributed to colonization efforts by selling certified rams to the eastern territories. If Ornicek was to leave Halle for Krivoj Rog, the quality of the Halle animals was doomed to decay with severe consequences for the production of Karakul pelts all over Europe. Let us then follow more closely Ornicek's research at Halle to understand the role of the Halle Karakul flock. Until he was mobilized to serve at the Wehrmacht in May 1943, most of his work dealt with the development genetics of curly hair in Karakul sheep. Ornicek explored the development of hair on Karakul skins through histological methods, having demonstrated namely that the banding of hair follicles determined the patterns of curl formation. Only by analyzing the origin and development processes of hair curl was it possible to establish a true biologic classification of the sheep, by contrast with classifications based solely on the phenotype, that is, the final appearance of the sheep pelt. Traditionally, many different types of curl had been identified in a great mass of names, which revealed no true difference, for there were just different development stages of the same curl type. This research should have significant results not only for the specific classification of Karakul, but also for many other domestic animals which also had similar processes of curl formation, such as in dogs, pigs, horses, chickens, goose, and also in humans. This way, Karakul was used as model organism to enlighten processes of hairy curl formation, allowing for proper biological classification to replace unreliable and crude phenotypic methods. Breeders at the University of Halle were the ones who established the standards for the classification of types of curl in Karakul pelts. For commercialization of the furs, there was no need to have any knowledge on the ways the curl developed. The value of the fur would be the same if hair orientation was tail skull or the opposite, as long as the fur presented an homogeneous pattern. But to make decisions about selections in a Karakul flock, such information was crucial. Hornicek reminded that several selection programs had been undertaken trying to fix pure lines of Karakul for different types of curl, with no knowledge of curl development processes, thus leading to different lines that were actually biologically identical. Their different furs were only different stages of development of the same type. As he bluntly asserted, selection of Karakul following the character curl type can't be solved by sheep raisers in their herd, and private initiative has no role in this class of tasks. Only scientific agriculture institutes may and should undertake such research work. Experiments undertaken since the 1910s had tried to prove the Mendelian behavior of the main characters in Karakul, namely brightness, color, curl, and tail shape. In 1917, the opening volume of the collection Bibliotheca Genetica, directed by Erwin Bauer, was dedicated exactly to Mendelian heredity in Karakul sheep. Karakul, because of their many characteristics, the curly hairs at birth, the black collar, the white spots, the S-formed fat tail, different lengths of the ears, the luster of the curls, etc., were considered as great experimental objects for academic breeders. Importantly, the research confirmed that those characters by which furs were valued had the great advantage of being dominant, thus allowing for crossings of Karakul rams with other sheep varieties. Sheep farmers, after acquiring a Karakul ram, could start producing valuable furs very quickly by crossing it with their local varieties. The negative side to it was the incapability of identifying pure blood Karakul and the proliferation of rams sold as such when they were actually the result of recent crossings. To have a transparent market of Karakul rams, there was the need to have genealogical certificates asserting the origins of the animals in question. The breeders at the University of Halle were the ones who established such normalized certificates. The records first used to experiment with university sheep became the standard for German commercial breeders. Each ram's file included information about genealogy, about 4 generations, birth date, brightness score, curl score, mating register, and etc. Also, as a crucial element of the ram's file, a photograph had to be included. And as expected, the photograph procedure was also standardized. Illumination, exposure time, distance. The curl type had, of course, to be recognizable, but the crucial thing was to take the picture 24 hours after birth. After that, the ram's hair starts to lose its characteristics, and the curls undo themselves. It should be mentioned, this is the reason why Karakul farmers, whose business is to produce furs which are valued exactly by those curly patterns, sacrifice the lambs immediately after their birth. To produce the much appreciated Astrakhan furs, Karakul are not supposed to live more than 48 hours. Karakul farming was as profitable as it was brutal. Now, it is now clear the role of Halle in the business of Karakul. Karakul rams were standardized to allow them to properly circulate in the market. The industrialization of pelt production by productive sheep farms was only possible by the production and circulation of standardized organisms. Without the genealogical books developed at Halle, sheep farmers wouldn't know how to evaluate a ram sold by a commercial breeder. More, Halle breeders systematically crossed Karakul with other sheep varieties, advising farmers which sheep to choose to cross with their expensive Karakul ram and still get the valuable furs. Only by crossing Karakul with local varieties were Karakul farmers able to establish themselves in very different geographic settings. Indeed, this was the reason the first Karakuls arrived in Halle in 1903. Julius Kuhn, director of the Agriculture Institute and responsible for introducing animal breeding as a main area of activity at the University of Halle, imported from Bukhara in Uzbekistan the first lot of 4 rams and 26 ewes into Germany. The initiative was taken jointly with Paul Albert Thorer, head of a major pelt firm in Leipzig. The aim was to bring Karakuls into Germany and demonstrate the possibility to raise them in Europe and keep their characteristics and thus dispense with the imports of pelts from Central Asia. However, the major success story of the Halle sheep was not located in Europe, but in Southwest Africa. The association between the academic Kuhn and the pelt merchant Thorer was also responsible for launching the initiative of Karakul farming in the German colony of Southwest Africa, today's Namibia. In a letter written in 1906 to the governor of the colony, Friedrich von Lindqvist, Thorer informed about his eagerness concerning Karakul breeding in Southwest Africa. For the promotion of pelt production in Southwest Africa, he would donate 3 rams and 23 ewes from the stud at Halle and acquire also animals directly in Bukhara. In February 1909, 22 rams, 252 ewes and 14 lambs were offloaded at the port of Swakopmund in Namibia. These animals were the basis of the government stud in Southwest Africa, placed at the research station Forstenwalde, 15 kilometers west of Windhoek, which subsequently was to be the source for private pure flocks for Karakul ram production, as well as Karakul crossbred flocks for pelt production. Now, anyone slightly familiar with the history of German Southwest Africa would place this apparently innocent circulation of sheep in the violent context of Germany's colonial experience. The projects for the establishment of Karakul farms in Southwest Africa were a direct consequence of the wars against the Herero and Nama held from 1904 to 1907, and that resulted in the annihilation by German colonial rulers of around 80% of the first and 50% of the later. This has been repeatedly depicted by the historiography as Germany's first encounter with genocide in the 20th century. And it has been used to make comparisons between colonial practices in Africa and Nazi behavior later in occupied Europe. Here, I want to illuminate such relations by connecting African and European experiences of the frontier through Karakul. It is not just a question of formal comparison, but of material circulation of industrialized organisms. Under the imperial decree of 26 December 1905, pertaining to the sequestration of property of natives in the protectorate of Southwest Africa, issued by von Lindqvist, the old territory of Hereroland in central Southwest Africa, and later the old Namaland in Southwest Africa, passed to the possession of German colonial rulers. General von Trotte, brutal repression of the Herero and Nama rebellion paved the way for the proper settlement of the territory, transforming it into a blank slate ready for the establishment of brave German pioneers. Analogous to the promise made to the SS members of idyllic farms in the open spaces of Eastern Europe, after the victory over the Bolsheviks, a huge portion of the new Southwest Africa settlers came from military ranks after the mobilization following the victory over indigenous rebellions. Military were allotted units of 5,000 hectares a person at the cost of 30 pfennigs a hectare. The size of each settling unit already gives a hint of the challenges faced by the white colonization project. It is difficult to imagine how the vast, arid, dusty plateau that makes much of Namibia could support visions of wealthy communities of German settlers producing for world markets. And here enters Karakul. If Karakul farmers in Europe had to be very cautious with dangers brought by excessive humidity, Southwest Africa had an environment very similar to that of the Bukhara region where Karakul originated from. The grasses and bushes were also perfect fodder for Karakul, who couldn't feel more at home. In the interwar years, under the administration of the Union of South Africa, Karakul pelts would become the cornerstone of Namibian economy. By the 1940s, Karakul pelts were responsible for no less than 4/5 of overseas exports of the territory, usually overcoming diamonds as the basis of its economy. The miracle of making the desert produce valuable goods was achieved by dotting the Hereroland and Namaland with extensive white settlers' Karakul farms that replaced the open spaces of the transhumance routes. To sustain this colonial conformation, a steady supply of pure rams and ewes was needed, which was provided first and foremost by the University of Halle flock in Germany till the end of the 1930s. But if the research undertaken at the Institute for Animal Breeding was tightly connected to German colonization of the arid areas of southwestern Africa through sheep farms, in the Nazi period, Halle scientists were praising and exploring Karakul properties for the colonization of Eastern Europe. In 1937, 3 professors, from the University of Halle, the already mentioned Gustav Fröhlich, Theodor Romer, and Emil Worman, presented to the Kaiser Wilhelm Society their project for a new institute which was to become the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Animal Breeding, inaugurated in 1939, with Fröhlich serving as director. To confirm the importance of the subject of animal breeding for Nazi expansionist ambitions, suffice to say that by 1944, this institute had the second largest budget of the entire Kaiser Wilhelm Society, second only to the Plant Breeding Institute. And after following sheep around, it is no surprise to find out that the Halle Karakul flock traveled together with Gustav Fröhlich from Halle to Rostock and was considered one of the major assets of the new institution. Nonetheless, after the death of Fröhlich in 1940, the flock would return to Halle to be managed by Olnicek. But let us stop for a moment at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute facilities. For the buildings and location of the new flamboyant institution deserve mention. The society had at its disposal a vast holding of some 800 hectares in Dummerstorf, near Rostock, in the province of Mecklenburg. Those familiar with the works of Günter Grass can easily make an image of a landscape where the most distinctive feature are endless and boring potato fields. The architects of the society adapted the previous farm into a scientific institution, preserving the original central building from which radiated the many different departments and their laboratories of morphology, physiology, biological chemistry, genetics, and veterinary medicine. The institute, following Gustav Fröhlich, was to become a central research institution for the whole of German breeding, and it would become the largest such facility in entire Europe. The model institution also had residential buildings, a school, a swimming pool, a community building with social facilities, farm buildings, and of course, many stables. All the facilities were surrounded by green areas, with every residential house deserving their respective private garden. Streets and squares were also lined by dense rows of trees. The institution was conceived as no less than a model settler community as the ones Germans were to establish in the eastern frontier. But the travels of Karakul don't finish here. Let us stick here to the fascist connection and follow now the circulation of sheep from Germany into Italy. In April 1931, or following the official calendar of Mussolini's regime, the year 9 of the fascist era, Francesco Maiocco, the head of the National Institute of Rabbit Breeding, Istituto Nazionale di Coniglicoltura in Alessandria, presented to the Ministry of Agriculture, Giacomo Acerbo, a detailed account of the Italian pelt production in which rabbits played a central role. In the previous years, the Institute had been developing standards of body weight and pelts quality to put in accordance rabbit producers and pelt merchants. Maiocco made his best efforts to offer dignity to the modest object of research of his institution, reminding that the city of Milano alone consumed no less than 25,000 rabbits every week, and that Florence needed a supply of some 1 million rabbits per year. In a country embarked in a battle for self-sufficiency that would only become harsher in the following years, rabbits, following Maiocco, could become an important resource in supplying the flourishing national fashion market and in decreasing as well Italian imports of proteins. The Alessandria Institute had by then established formal relations with some 6,000 rabbit growers, forming numerous local breeding circles whose statutes were also designed by Maiocco himself. He actually worked closely with the fascist mass organizations such as Dopo Lavoro, or After Work, which the Nazis would later translate into the Kraft durch Freude, or Strength through Joy, of Robert Lay's Labor Front. The task of mobilizing the immense number of breeders and friends of rabbits, in Maiocco's words, was not easy, for we are talking of a highly dispersed group of small growers located mainly in the suburbs of the main Italian cities, feeding the animals with the produce of their home vegetable gardens. Only through the mass organizations of the regime was it possible to reach this diffuse population and standardize their breeding practices. 8 years after, in 1939, Majocco welcomed once more the Ministry of Agriculture in Alessandria. But this time he was joined by no less a figure than Mussolini in person. He boasted again the great work of his institute in contributing to the Italian yearly production of 50 million rabbits, from which he received the praise of the Duce, and 400,000 lire extra for his research work. In exchange for the generous donation, the head of the regime demanded to double the production to 100 million rabbits in order to significantly contribute to the autarky national effort. Majocco apparently didn't shy from the dictator's request and in addition made new promises concerning a new pelt animal developed by the institute, the Karakul sheep. The pledge now was that mass production of Karakul was to totally cover the needs of the Milan fashion industry that consumed some 200 to 300,000 Astrakhan pelts of Afghan and Southwest Africa origin, purchased in the two big world markets in London and Leipzig, thus saving Italy an appreciable amount of foreign currency. To materialize his promise, Majocco offered Mussolini a Karakul lamb from his institute's herd. The Alessandria National Institute of Rabbit Breeding was thus to become a center of Karakul circulation, supplying Italian brave settlers in the Italian African colonies of Libya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Just to locate you a little bit, this is like in the backwards there is a map of the Italian Empire. So this is the Mediterranean. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Here you have Italy, and this is the Libyan colony, and here the Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea, which formed the Eastern African Italian Empire, or the AOE. But before we explore the circuit from Italy to Africa, we still have to understand how Majocco was able to form his pure Karakul flock in Alessandria. His interest for Karakul was raised first by his visit in the end of 1930 to a pelts fair in Leipzig, where he saw the furs exhibited by the above-mentioned company. But more importantly, in March of the following year, the Halle Animal Breeding Institute brought to the 12th Milan Pelts Fair a small group of Karakul sheep whose picture made the April front page of the journal Coniglicoltura, Rabbit Breeding, edited by the Alessandria Institute. Although a few Italian private farmers had already imported some Karakul rams from several European countries, the naive nature of these first essays drove Majocco to try to emulate the Halle example and seize the opportunity of launching Karakul production in Italy through the standards and methods established by his own institute. More than just offering a traditional extension service to farmers, he designed a research program concerning acclimation assays and crossing of Karakul rams with local ewes. Following the German model, he also established a genealogical book to be managed by the Ministry of Agriculture or alternatively by the Alessandria Institute itself. To undertake such program, the crucial thing was, of course, to count with expensive animals, which were acquired from the flock exhibited by the Halle Institute at the Milano Fair. In addition, Majocco traveled that same summer of 31 to Germany, where he not only visited the main German Karakul breeders, but also stayed at Halle to become acquainted with Gustav Fröhlich's work in crossing Karakuls with European breeds. In the following years, the Alessandria Institute Journal would offer detailed accounts of the growing of its Karakul flock, celebrating the good qualities of the newborn lambs. From the first small group formed from the imports from Halle, the herd numbered in 1940 130 pure-blood Karakul sheep. And the numbers were not the only thing to grow. Plans around Karakuls also became more and more ambitious. The original aim of importing Karakul to Italy was to cross them with local breeds such as Lecese Moscia and establish Karakul farms in the impoverished areas of the Mezzogiorno, namely in Puglia, Calabria, and Campania, kind of internal frontier of Italy. But in the 1930s, to settle the empire with peasants from the overpopulated regions of Italy, diverting migration headed to the Americas, to the Italian possessions in Africa, would progressively become a cornerstone policy of the fascist regime. When looking at the climatic conditions of much of those territories, with its vast desert and semi-desert areas in Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia, Karakul farms offered the hope of reproducing the German miracle in Southwest Africa of producing gold in the form of furs out of the desert. Of course, as it had happened previously with the German colonial experience, what are useless desert regions to the eyes of the colonizer is a more complex reality for those inhabiting it. The establishment of Italian brave settlers in the new Italian frontier was also to be preceded by a violent genocide story. If Italian atrocities during the occupation of Abyssinia in 1935 and 1936 with ruthless gas attacks and terrorist tactics were object of open disapproval in the international press at the time, only more recently have historians started to delve into the violent character of Italian colonial rule more generally. Scholars such as Nicola LaBanca have explored in the last 2 decades the grim realities of namely the 16 concentration camps that operated between 1930 and 1933 in the Cyrenaica region in the eastern half of present Libya. Following his account, almost 100,000 people of the nomadic and semi-nomadic populations, that is roughly half the population of eastern Libya, were forced to settle in the camps. Punishment, executions, and deaths by starvation were daily occurrences. Only 60,000 came out alive. This was the dark balance of the pacification of Cyrenaica by the governor Pietro Badoglio, paving the way for Italian peasant colonization. By October 1938, Italo Balbo, one of the most popular figures among the fascist leadership, and who was appointed governor of Libya in 1933 after Badoglio, organized in grand style a fleet of 17 ships that brought in some 20,000 colonists to occupy the 26 new model villages designed by Italian planners. The truth is the scale of the planning was no less ambitious than the one of Eastern Europe, designed by Himmler's experts just 1 year after. As described by E.J. Russell, the director of the Rothamsted Experiment Station, the British National Agricultural Experiment Station, as this Libyan colonization is by far the largest group settlement ever undertaken, its progress will be watched with the deepest interest by all concerned with colonization, and certainly by many administrators in the British Empire. And, as in the German case, Karakul farms were to be an integral part of the new settlements, namely in the Cyrenaica. These farms were to be managed exclusively by white settlers, since the detailed recording procedures to properly conduct the Karakul herd immediately excluded the possibility of any native farmers. Also, Karakul explorations were cautiously delimited by barbed wire and constituted a typical sedentary operation, not deemed appropriate to the local nomadic and semi-nomadic costumes. Already in 1932, Mayoko was asked by the responsible of animal breeding of the Sidi Mesri experiment station in Libya to deliver 2 Karakul rams and 4 ewes. The animals arrived in the colony in May 1934 with the certificates from the Zootechnic Institute of Prague, whose flock was started, not surprisingly, with animals from Halle. 3 months after its arrival in Libya, one of the expensive rams died, forcing the crossing experiments with the local fat tail breed, the Barbaresca, to be conducted with a single Karakul ram. In the following years, the Alessandria Institute would start shipping rams from its own flock to the local experiment stations scattered through the Italian Empire, including Ethiopia from 1936 onwards. But Mayoko was the first to recognize that independently of the rhythm he grew his Alexandria flock, it would always be too small to accomplish the grand plans associated with Karakul sustaining Italian communities in the semi-arid areas of the empire. The problem was only more serious when taking into consideration the increasing difficulties in purchasing Karakul rams all over the world. Russia and Southwest Africa, the 2 main world producers, forbade any commerce with Italy. And it was extremely onerous to buy rams in Germany, which sold each ram at a scandalous price of 1,200 mark in 1939, in a situation of extreme scarcity of foreign currency for the Italian economy. All these difficulties supported Mayoko's reasoning that the development of Karakul farms was totally dependent on his institute, which was not able to deliver more than 100 pure rams to farmers by the end of 1939, half of them to the colonial territories. In good conditions, these rams would be able to fertilize in 1 year some 4,000 ewes, which would be highly insufficient to cover the national demand for pelts. The solution lied in making intensive use of artificial insemination techniques, which were being developed in the recently founded experimental Italian institute Lazzaro Spallanzani for artificial insemination in Milano. I don't have much time to develop here the argument of artificial insemination in this paper, but it will be enough to refer that Telesforo Bonadonna, the director of the institute, reported results from his experiments with Karakul of the order of 1,000 ewes inseminated by a single ram. The 50 rams Mayoko promised to deliver to the African colonies would thus be able to cover every year some 50,000 ewes. The first experiment started in Libya in 1939 with only 12 ships and several sperm concentrations to establish the conditions for the use of the technique in the climate of the Cyrenaica. The 4 basic steps of artificial insemination, collecting, diluting, conservation, and inseminating properly, were to be undertaken under strictly standardized rules. After that, 1,592 local Barbaresca ewes were inseminated with encouraging results. Also, several experiments were made to inquire about the possibility of shipping by airplane the ram sperm from Italy to the colonies, namely between Milano and Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital. As Bonadonna emphatically made clear, this was to be considered the first shipment of sperm from Europe to African tropical countries. And it were experiments like this one that made possible to think of gigantic undertakings, such as the 1939 project of a Karakul farm of some 20,000 hectares or some 49,000 acres in Jigiga, not far from Harar in eastern Ethiopia. To inseminate the 8,000 local ewes, one apparently didn't need more than a few Karakul rams whose sperm could actually be shipped from Alessandria. The truth is, Italian imperial dreams would abruptly come to an end in 1941 with Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian emperor, re-entering Addis Ababa in the 5th of May of that year. But while the Italian fascist regime was desperately fighting to keep its empire, the Portuguese, profiting from their neutrality in World War II, were engaging that same year in the southwest of Angola, in the Namib Desert, their last war of pacification of their African colonies. This region, immediately north from Namibia, so the region I'm talking about now will be around here, will be a fringe around here. These are more or less the size of Portugal. And the previous one of the southwest, so Namibia was Southwest Africa, so these two regions were tightly close together. So this region, immediately north to Namibia, was properly identified as the last frontier of the Portuguese Empire, inhabited mainly by the nomadic Kuvale, who are no other than the Herero from Angola. To keep with the brutal tone of the paper, at the beginning of the 1940s, the Portuguese army mobilized 1,000 soldiers, in addition to other some 1,000 native troops and 2 airplanes to fight a local population of no more than 5,000 Kuvales shepherds, accused, probably rightly, of stealing cattle from settler ranches in the highlands. A typical frontier story that made the script of many Westerns. During 5 months, the Portuguese military embarked in a man's hunt throughout this desert area, executing prisoners in barbaric ways, confiscating some 20,000 cattle heads, roughly 90% of the total number of animals in possession of the Kuvale, and imprisoning more than 3,500 people, deporting the vast majority to the cocoa plantations of the island of São Tomé, or sending them to diamond mines in the northern region of Angola. So with the example of German West Africa, just south of the border, one didn't have to be very imaginative to start envisaging ways of making this desert area contribute to the imperial economy. In 1944, the governor of the region demanded Santos Pereira, the responsible for the local services of veterinary, to inquire the possibility of reproducing the German experience with caracoles in this desert fringe between the sea and the highlands. Pereira traveled around Namibia and South Africa and was quick to give a positive answer to the governor's request, although reminding that to acquire purebred rams from the Namibian breeders would be impossible for their fear of competition from the northern neighbor. The first rams were thus bought only after the end of World War II from the USDA flock in Washington. Nevertheless, it was only after a second import in 1952 of Karakul sheep from Germany, 10 rams and 2 ewes with the Halle stamp, that more encouraging results started to appear. A Karakul experiment station was founded in 1948 in the middle of the desert, but only 78 kilometers from the seaport of Moçambique, to which it was connected by a railway line. It was directed by Pereira himself, with the entire arid area of southwest Angola, some 10 million hectares, a bit more than the size of Portugal, now put under the regime of Karakul Reserve. By the beginning of the 1950s, there were 30 Karakul farms occupying an area of 300,000 hectares, with the experiment station at its center. Following Pereira, one needed at least a total of 5,000 sheep to keep a viable exploration, with the station lending its pure rams to inseminate the farmer's flock. Artificial insemination was now a common practice, with a single ram being able to fertilize some 15,000 ewes every year. This deep relation between the station and the farms was enough to perceive Pereira as the true father of this brave pioneer community settled in an arid region previously uncolonized. And Pereira didn't limit himself to distribute around the genes of his precious Halle Karakul rams. He would also be found 4 days a week crossing this region in his Chevy truck, overseeing the different farms, checking barbed fences, beverage points, or the management of the dry grasslands. He boasted to drive no less than 9,000 miles every month. Back at the post, his wife was responsible to keep a typical Portuguese atmosphere in the house, which was built as a model settler home, demonstrating that one could and should keep his civilized European manners in the middle of the desert. So this above, this will be the director's house above here. This will be the helper's house, and this is Pereira himself looking at the sperm of Karakul rams. A few yards away, for the accommodation of the station native workers, 15 huts were built in cement, forming a circle around the fountain in an adaptation of local building practices of which Pereira was really proud of. So it was these ones, the huts around here, that he was very fond of saying that this was a great adaptation of local constructions by using European modern methods of construction with cement. Fortunately, we have enough work done by anthropologists on the Kovala to understand the profoundly disrupting effects Karakul farms had for local populations. For shepherds whose transhumance trajectories were based in a profound knowledge of local environments, the location of the farms exactly in those points where water was accessible also prevented access to the richer pasturage areas. And even when new ditches were dug by colonial authorities to serve Kovala cattle, the farms occupied now several ogandas, the most important of the settled places along the year, which included a cemetery and ritual sites. It is important to remind here that the Kovala, after returning from their exile back to southwest Angola, always refused to be employed in the Karakul farms, preferring instead to keep their semi-nomadic practices. Even today, the post-colonial state of Angola considers the Kovala as a tribal group not yet integrated in the national community, which remains to be colonized. In 1975, less than 1 year after the overthrow of fascism in Portugal, the white settlers organized their last Karakul pelts auction in the city of Sá da Bandeira to produce enough international currency for their escape through Namibia and South Africa amid the violent turmoil of the independence period. The Karakul farms, not surprisingly, were ransacked, with those sheep that survived now promiscuously mixed with local varieties. Nowadays, the area is again the territory of the Kovala and their mobile herds. So, thanks very much.